When you order at a fast food place, you assume you're getting what you asked for. Well, two customers at Subway say there wasn't tuna in their tuna sandwich, and they are suing the sandwich shop. So we did our own test to see what's between the bread.
Every bite feels familiar. The soft bread, the smell of toasted sandwiches, the illusion of a healthy choice. Subway has built its name on convenience and freshness. But beneath that polished image lies a trail of disturbing truths that most customers never see. It's not just about what's in the sandwich, it's about what isn't being told. From misleading labels to questionable sourcing, there's a side to Subway that's been kept quiet for too long. And once you know, walking in won't feel the same again. What Subway doesn't want you to think about. But what's inside the sandwich is only half the story. Because when you start peeling back the layers of Subway's meat selections, the truth becomes even harder to swallow. The image of freshly sliced deli meats and sizzling chicken might comfort customers. But the reality behind those neatly stacked ingredients tells a much more processed tale. It was 2021 when things got particularly slippery for the chain, thanks to a viral headline that sent shockwaves across the fast food industry. Lab tests performed on Subway's tuna sandwiches revealed something unexpected. Researchers reportedly couldn't find any detectable tuna DNA at all. Not a trace. In response, Subway maintained that its tuna was real, claiming the DNA may have degraded during the cooking process, a scientifically plausible explanation, but one that didn't satisfy many curious customers. After all, if what's labeled tuna doesn't register as tuna under a microscope, it leaves much room for doubt. But this wasn't an isolated blip. Just a few years earlier, in 2017, the CBC's bombshell chicken DNA report already had the public questioning how much real meat actually ends up between those sandwich buns. Now, with the tuna episode fresh in memory, eyes turned to the rest of Subway's meats. And what they found wasn't exactly comforting. Across the board, Subway's meats, be it turkey, ham, or the rotisserie chicken, seem to share something oddly uniform, almost suspiciously so. That's because nearly all of it arrives pre-cooked, pre-seasoned, and vacuum-packed from centralized processing facilities. It's a system built for efficiency, ensuring that a turkey sandwich in Chicago tastes exactly like one in Charlotte. But with that consistency comes a cost: individuality and authenticity. Much of Subway's protein lineup, especially their cold cuts, is what food scientists refer to as restructured meat products. It's a technical term for meat broken down, mixed with additives, flavorings, and binding agents, then pressed into a mold and reshaped. Those flawless, rounded slices of ham or that perfect disc of grilled chicken. They're likely the result of industrial shaping and high-pressure processing, not a butcher's knife. This explains why the flavors can sometimes blur together. The chicken, the turkey, even the ham, though labeled differently, often share a similar underlying taste. Experts attribute this to the specific cocktail of preservatives, flavor enhancers, and modified food starches used throughout their production. It's not just about preserving the meat for transport or reheating. It's about engineering a flavor profile that's unmistakably Subway. And it doesn't stop at the ingredients themselves. Consider the journey these meats take. Industry reports have traced cold-cut combos to as many as 7 different processing plants, each responsible for a step in preparing the final product. From grinding and seasoning to molding and packaging, every stage is fine-tuned to deliver meat that looks the same, lasts longer, and fits Subway's branding strategy. It's a logistical triumph, yes, but one that raises serious concerns about how far removed this food is from anything natural. Subway has defended its practices by pointing to food safety standards and the demand for consistency. But for many, that explanation only deepens the discomfort. After all, when a single sandwich contains processed proteins from multiple sources, possibly handled in different regions before ending up behind a single sneeze guard, what exactly are we trusting? As customers began demanding transparency, what once seemed like a harmless fast food fix began to unravel into something far darker. A manufactured illusion of freshness, crafted in boardrooms and molded in factories. But the meat scandal was only the beginning. As more customers uncovered the layers of deception, a new, even more shocking issue was about to surface. The surprising truth behind Subway's fresh bread. Subway's bread has been at the center of controversy recently, but not for the reasons you might expect. In 2020, Ireland's Supreme Court dropped a bombshell that caused waves throughout the fast food world. Subway's bread, long touted as a fresh, wholesome option, was suddenly deemed unfit to be called bread. The reason? It contained 5 times more sugar than Irish law allows for bread products. Each foot-long serving packed about 50 grams of sugar, making what was marketed as a healthy sandwich seem more like dessert than lunch. The revelation not only left Subway scrambling for answers, but also made their healthy sandwich promises seem more like an illusion. However, the sugar content wasn't the only eyebrow-raising ingredient found in Subway's bread. Enter azodicarbonamide, a chemical compound that sounds like something you'd accidentally type on your keyboard when falling asleep. Used as a dough conditioner, this industrial additive was another surprising twist in the Subway saga. It wasn't just confined to their sandwiches. Azodicarbonamide is also used in non-food items like yoga mats. Once the public caught wind of this, the backlash was swift and severe. Subway defended its use for months, insisting it was safe. But the pressure eventually led the company to remove the chemical from their bread. They never quite explained why their bread needed to be as flexible as a yoga mat, leaving many to wonder just how much of their food was truly fresh. And if that wasn't enough to raise suspicions, let's talk about the iconic smell that greets you every time you step into a Subway store. The mouth-watering scent of freshly baked bread is practically synonymous with the brand. But here's the truth. It's not the smell of real bread baking. That irresistible aroma is actually a manufactured scent, pumped through the store's ventilation system to create the illusion of freshly baked bread. It's a clever trick to make you crave that sandwich long before you even get to the counter. While it's certainly effective, it also reveals that Subway's bread-making process is far less authentic than it appears. Instead of mixing, kneading, and baking dough on-site, Subway's stores receive pre-mixed dough sticks. These dough sticks, filled with preservatives and conditioning agents, are simply reheated and baked at each location. This method ensures that every loaf looks the same, perfectly uniform, and ready to be served. There's no artisanal process behind it, just a quick warm-up before it's ready for the customer. While this may be convenient and cost-effective, it shatters the illusion that the bread is freshly made on-site by skilled bakers. But what about the healthier options? Many customers opt for the 9-grain wheat bread, believing it to be the most nutritious choice. Unfortunately, this bread isn't as healthy as it seems. Food scientists discovered that it contains more sugar than many candy bars, which might make you rethink your decision the next time you go for that sweet onion chicken teriyaki. The sweetness doesn't just come from the sauce or toppings. It's embedded in the very bread you're eating. This revelation forces you to question just how healthy your sandwich really is. The story of Subway's bread is just the beginning of a much larger tale about the hidden ingredients and processes that go into making your sandwich. What many customers believe to be fresh, healthy food is, in fact, a carefully crafted product designed for mass production. While the company continues to market itself as a healthier alternative to traditional fast food, these revelations suggest otherwise. Subway's bread, which once seemed like a simple, wholesome choice, is now exposed as something far more complicated and much less healthy. As Subway continues to defend its ingredients, the public remains skeptical. While some may argue that these ingredients are safe, the lack of transparency and the ongoing scandals only erode the trust customers once had in the brand. The company's insistence that their sandwiches are a fresh, healthier option becomes increasingly difficult to believe, especially when confronted with the truth about what goes into their bread. The truth about Subway's bread and ingredients might not be as appetizing as the sandwiches themselves, but it's important to recognize that what we think we're eating might not be the same as what we're actually getting. The next time you step into a Subway store, take a moment to consider just how much of that fresh, wholesome image is crafted by clever marketing rather than by true quality ingredients. What once seemed like a simple, healthy choice now appears more like a carefully constructed illusion. How a missing inch turned into a corporate meltdown. And while the bread was already under scrutiny, what came next shrank more than just Subway's reputation. It shrank their sandwiches, literally. What began as an offhand observation in Australia back in 2013 quickly spiraled into a global PR nightmare. A customer unwrapped their Subway foot-long sandwich only to find it came up short, measuring just 11 inches. That one missing inch triggered a viral wave of consumer outrage as customers around the world brought measuring tapes to their meals, posting photos of undersized subs with a mix of disbelief and mockery. What was meant to be a casual lunch became a sandwich-sized scandal. Rather than address the issue head-on, Subway's first line of defense was almost comical. They claimed footlong was never a literal measurement, but more of a branding phrase, a suggestion rather than a promise. In other words, 12 inches was more of a vibe. But this semantic shuffle only fueled public anger. For customers who had trusted the name to mean what it said, being told that foot-long didn't actually mean a foot felt like a slap in the face. You could argue it was the fast food version of selling 10 eggs in a dozen. The backlash gathered steam until it landed in court as a class action lawsuit. Inside the courtroom, things got even more bizarre. Investigations revealed that around 80% of tested footlongs were under the promised size, some barely hitting 11 inches. Subway blamed baking inconsistencies, citing factors like temperature and humidity. Yes, apparently, the same company that could carefully portion every dollop of mustard and align pickle slices like military recruits couldn't manage to ensure their bread reached a consistent length. The idea that such a massive franchise, founded in 1965 and serving millions globally, was still wrestling with basic baking variables stunned even longtime fans. As the case unfolded, new layers of absurdity emerged. Subway's bread production process was supposedly guided by exact rules. From dough weight to shaping methods, everything was meticulously scripted. Yet somehow, their assembly line of sandwiches couldn't reliably meet the one expectation literally printed on the label. The court eventually forced Subway to implement better quality control across its franchises, including mandatory measuring tools and tighter training protocols. Franchises were no longer allowed to guesstimate with a glance. They now had to treat sandwich making with the precision of a science lab. But even then, Subway refused to guarantee every sandwich would be 12 inches, citing natural fluctuations during baking. Court documents allowed for a half-inch margin of error, small on paper, but huge when your entire brand hinges on precision. Alongside the $500,000 to $20,000 in legal fees, Subway had to revise its promotional materials and menu language to reflect approximate sizing. For customers, that kind of corporate backpedaling turned a simple inch into a much larger issue: trust. What should have been a straightforward fix, ensuring a sandwich measures what it advertises, revealed a deeper flaw in the company's operations. This wasn't just about missing bread. It was about accountability. And to many, it was proof that Subway's shiny marketing promises didn't always match what was being unwrapped at the table. So, if Subway was willing to downplay something as simple as sandwich size, what other corners might they be cutting? Stay tuned to uncover the truth. Behind the counter, the hidden cost of owning a Subway. While customers were still digesting the revelations about sandwich sizes, what many hadn't yet seen was the pressure cooker environment simmering behind the counter, a system that some franchise owners began to describe as less of a business opportunity and more of a financial trap dressed as fast food. To open a single Subway location, aspiring owners had to cough up hefty upfront costs, ranging anywhere from $15,000 to a jaw-dropping $300,000. But those entry fees were just the start. Once in, franchisees found themselves tangled in a rulebook so thick it could double as a booster seat, dictated by a corporation that micromanaged every slice, spread, and sprinkle. Every ingredient had to be sourced through Subway's exclusive vendor network, which charged significantly above market prices. One owner noted they paid up to 50% more for tomatoes than what they'd pay just down the road at a local supplier. No, these weren't organic, heirloom, or sun-kissed by the gods. Just tomatoes. Overpriced and uninspired. This overpriced supply chain meant owners were often backed into corners financially, forcing tough decisions just to stay afloat. Corners got cut. Fast. From employee wages to training, from equipment maintenance to even how fresh really was, the strain bled into every inch of the business. According to industry data, the average Subway franchise pulled in just $31,000 in profit annually. That's not the kind of number that turns heads unless you're calculating the annual cost of ramen in a college dorm. For many franchisees, dreams of financial freedom quickly turned into a grueling grind for survival. As the squeeze tightened, it wasn't just franchise owners feeling the pressure. Employees did too. Workers often found themselves running entire stores alone, juggling the grill, register, mop, and customer complaints like a one-person food court. The position of sandwich artist began to resemble a solo act in a chaotic kitchen circus. And with average wages barely scraping minimum wage, it's little surprise that turnover rates were higher than the daily bread delivery. Training, if it could be called that, was often laughable. New hires recalled being thrown behind the counter after watching a couple of outdated training videos or trailing someone who had barely mastered the menu themselves. One former worker said their entire food safety orientation boiled down to a single sentence: "If it doesn't smell bad, it's probably fine." Another recalled learning proper ingredient portions by copying whatever the last person did, resulting in sandwiches that resembled abstract edible puzzles, each one more creatively lopsided than the last. These financial and operational pressures gave rise to practices that blurred the line between cost-cutting and outright negligence. Reports began surfacing of employees being told to scrape off moldy vegetables and keep the parts that looked usable. In one instance, a franchisee allegedly relabeled mayonnaise containers to extend their shelf life, treating expired condiments like they were aging into something sophisticated. Health codes existed, but whether they were followed or not often depended on whether a corporate inspector was scheduled to visit. And when those inspections did roll around, stores transformed overnight. Word of a surprise check would set off a full-blown panic scrub. Counters gleamed, expired ingredients mysteriously vanished. Gloves were worn like never before, and food safety protocols suddenly became gospel. But the show usually lasted only as long as it took the inspector's car to leave the lot. Once the coast was clear, many workers admitted it was back to business as usual. Even more frustrating was the realization that escaping the subway system wasn't simple. The franchise contracts, thick with legalese, were crafted to keep owners locked in with few exits. Walking away from a store didn't just mean giving up a business. It often meant walking into a mountain of debt. Some franchisees said leaving Subway felt like trying to quit a club that made you pay a fine just to stop showing up. As more stories leaked, it became clear that the foot-long scandal was just a surface issue. Beneath the bread and branding was a system stretched too thin, where loyalty was rewarded with red tape, and where even the most basic promises of quality, of support, of fairness seemed to evaporate under the heat of corporate control. What customers saw in the dining area was just the polished veneer. The real story, baked into the walls of each store, was far less appetizing. Critical health code violations. But just when it seemed things couldn't get worse for Subway franchisees, a darker layer began to peel back, one that made the public question not just the business model, but the very safety of the food being served. In 2023 alone, over 2,000 Subway locations across the U.S. were hit with critical health code violations, an unsettling number that surpassed even the lengthiest of their topping lists. These weren't just minor slip-ups. They were full-blown warnings that pointed to dangerous, recurring patterns. Temperature abuse was among the most frequently flagged issues. Health inspectors routinely discovered meats and cheeses left out in the open for hours, slowly warming into potential health hazards. In one Florida store, tuna salad was stored at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, inviting bacteria to settle in like it was their new home. The infamous cold-cut combo was beginning to resemble a petri dish, more than a sandwich. Cross-contamination wasn't just a risk. It became a routine. Employees were seen preparing food with the same gloves used to handle cash, turning every sandwich into a gamble with germs. One store in Ohio boldly used a single cutting board for both vegetables and raw chicken, unknowingly crafting a real-life version of foodborne illness roulette. And vegetable hygiene? That term seemed optional in some locations. Some stores did little more than splash cold water over lettuce for a second or two before tossing it into the serving tray. One inspector noted the greens still had soil clinging to their leaves. Another found tomatoes resting inside a tub that had previously housed cleaning chemicals, perhaps a misguided attempt to scrub them from the inside out. Mold wasn't just a hidden problem. It was practically a resident. Inspectors uncovered mold clinging to walls, lurking behind sandwich prep counters, and even thriving inside ice machines. Walk-in coolers were reported to look more like failed science experiments than safe storage areas, with vegetables rotting in forgotten corners. At one location, a meat slicer was so crusted with leftover particles that it could have built its own sandwich. The pest control situation was no better. Mice left trails of droppings around food storage areas in multiple stores, and one Texas location was forced to shut down temporarily after cockroaches were seen crawling across the sandwich station mid-shift. Ants were found inside a sugar container at another spot, apparently unimpressed with the artificial sweeteners. But perhaps most telling was the state of the equipment. Thermometers that didn't work, fridges on the fritz, and cutting boards with gouges deep enough to trap bacteria all became recurring themes. One inspector remarked that the grime buildup inside a slicer suggested it hadn't been cleaned properly in weeks. Some soap dispensers were mysteriously filled with water instead of soap, an apparent cost-cutting hack that would make even the most laid-back germaphobe lose their appetite. In other cases, perfectly functional sinks were rendered useless, blocked by boxes, equipment, or stacks of stale bread no one seemed willing to toss out. These weren't isolated lapses. They painted a disturbing pattern of neglect and desperation. In some cases, it wasn't just carelessness, it was survival. Franchise owners, cornered by crushing costs and rigid contracts, were sometimes forced to stretch every dollar, even at the expense of safety. But for customers, what was served up wasn't just a sandwich. It was a potential health risk wrapped in branded paper. And while Subway's marketing continued to promise freshness and quality, the reality behind the scenes was growing harder to ignore. The empire that ate itself. As the unsettling realities behind Subway's kitchen operations sparked nationwide concern, another problem loomed even larger, one buried in spreadsheets, strip malls, and shuttered storefronts. The fast food giant, once hailed as the undisputed ruler of sandwich supremacy, had built its empire on a foundation that was quietly cracking beneath its feet. At its peak, Subway had more locations than McDonald's worldwide. The growth was dizzying. Between 2005 and 2015, the chain added thousands of new stores in what seemed like an unstoppable sprint toward total market domination. But this wasn't careful expansion. It was a land grab. Subway's every corner counts approach led to stores sprouting up in every imaginable space. Some towns in Pennsylvania ended up with half a dozen locations within just 2 miles. In gas stations, inside big box stores, and even crammed into renovated phone booths. If it had walls and a roof, Subway was there. What looked like success on paper quickly turned toxic on the ground. Franchisees who invested their savings and hopes into the brand found themselves trapped in a turf war with fellow Subway owners. The corporation's eagerness to plant new stores didn't take into account the cannibalization it caused. One owner watched in disbelief as a new Subway opened just steps away from his own, inside the very same shopping plaza. Sales nosedived by 40% overnight. It wasn't outside competition that threatened their survival. It was the brand itself turning inward and devouring its own. By 2023, the cost of this unchecked sprawl was impossible to ignore. Over 700 locations closed their doors that year alone, part of a broader collapse that had seen more than 7,000 permanent closures since 2015. These weren't just business losses, they were personal tragedies. Behind each shuttered store was an owner who had gambled everything and lost. The average annual revenue per store plummeted from $480,000 to $350,000 in a decade, with some outposts seeing less foot traffic than a butcher shop in a vegan neighborhood. In an effort to stay afloat, desperate owners tried everything. One worked solo for 6 months, prepping, serving, and cleaning all by himself. Another transformed part of their dining area into a convenience corner, stacking shelves with snacks and soda in hopes of luring in local traffic. But even these creative pivots couldn't balance the scales against mounting rent, rising food costs, and franchise fees that bled them dry. To make matters worse, escaping the franchise wasn't as simple as handing over the keys. Subway maintained strict control over who could buy existing stores. Many owners who wanted out found themselves stuck, unable to sell, unable to recoup losses, and in many cases, watching their investment become worthless. Some shops were valued at less than the cost it took to open them, making the phrase "fire sale" feel far too generous. Even as the company tried to slow its closures, dropping from 1,000 annual shutdowns to around 400 in 2023, the damage had already been done. Empty storefronts with faded "Eat Fresh" signs became markers of a failed promise, while the once glowing image of Subway turned cold and corporate. Instead of building communities, Subway's model tore them apart, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin and broken dreams. The brand's pursuit of domination had become its downfall. Like a sandwich overloaded with too many ingredients, it all started falling apart under its own weight. But did becoming a franchisee give one control over owning a Subway? Stay tuned to find out. The cost of control. But what many of those franchisees didn't realize, until it was far too late, was that owning a Subway came with chains not just around their wallets, but around their entire lives. Behind the bright lights and familiar green and yellow signs was a corporate system built less on partnership and more on control. Subway didn't just ask for a piece of the pie, it took the whole kitchen. Opening a single store often required an investment between $150,000 and $300,000, and most owners weren't big investors or seasoned restaurateurs. They were everyday people, teachers cashing in their retirement funds, couples remortgaging homes, immigrants pouring in life savings for a shot at the American dream. But that dream quickly twisted into something darker. Once inside, owners found themselves caught in contracts that rivaled steel traps. Subway's franchise agreement wasn't just strict, it was suffocating. Even as locations oversaturated and sales dropped, getting out of the system became nearly impossible. A store that cost hundreds of thousands to build might now be worth less than a second-hand food truck. And when these struggling owners tried to sell, corporate had the power to block the deal entirely or bury it under conditions no buyer could meet. They called it a franchise opportunity. But for many, it felt more like a sentence. Some tried to tough it out. A few ran their stores completely alone, clocking 70 or even 80 hours a week just to stay afloat, cutting vegetables by dawn, handling the register through lunch, scrubbing ovens by night. Others converted unused seating areas into mini-marts, selling snacks, phone chargers, lottery tickets, anything to squeeze out a few more dollars. But these patchwork fixes weren't enough to stop the bleeding. And the worst part? Help never came. Subway's corporate team wasn't in the business of rescue. They were in the business of royalties and control. Many franchisees who asked for support were met with silence, or worse, retaliation. Speaking out could mean being labeled non-compliant, a scarlet letter in a system where obedience was expected, not partnership. The emotional cost was brutal. Depression, burnout, broken marriages. Some owners didn't just lose money, they lost years of their lives. Families crumbled under the weight of a business that promised stability but delivered stress. For the people behind the counters, Eat Fresh wasn't just a slogan. It was a mask, a cheery front hiding lives quietly unraveling. The hidden hazards behind the counter. And, as if financial collapse wasn't enough, what's happening behind the counter in many Subway stores reveals a much deeper concern, one that reaches every customer who's ever placed an order. While the storefronts may look clean and inviting, the reality behind the scenes tells a different story. At countless locations, a single worker, often a teenager or someone with no experience, is left to manage an entire shift alone. That includes preparing food, running the register, baking bread, cleaning, and handling mobile orders, all at once. With no support and barely any training, the system isn't just unfair, it's dangerous. Food safety becomes the first casualty. Gloves are reused, cleaning gets skipped, And meats, veggies, and sauces sit for hours without temperature checks. Expired ingredients are frequently used just to stretch inventory. Employees have spoken of wilted lettuce, old tuna, and unwashed containers being passed off as fresh, not out of laziness, but desperation. Even corporate inspections are mostly for show. Workers are warned in advance, giving them just enough time to scrub surfaces, rotate out spoiled items, and hide the daily reality. Once the inspector leaves, everything reverts to survival mode. When a business handles raw meat, dairy, and fresh vegetables, there's no room for shortcuts. But at Subway, shortcuts have become the routine, and that puts every customer at risk, from cross-contamination to allergens and even foodborne illness. Since 2015, more than 5,000 stores have shut down. In 2023 alone, 700 disappeared. Revenues keep dropping, yet the corporation clings to expansion instead of reform. For franchisees, employees, and customers alike, the promise of "Eat Fresh" now rings hollow. Behind that sandwich is often a store barely hanging on and a worker stretched beyond their limit. But what do you think caused a fast-growing sandwich empire to cannibalize its stores and crush its franchisees? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.